Good afternoon, good day. Thanks, Dr. Spielman, for this honorable invitation. And it's going to be a very beautiful panorama. My share are the biomes Pantanal, Cerrado, Chaco, and Pampa, sort of more open type vegetation. Here, this pink trumpet tree is a symbol of the Pantanal and is the favorite nesting site of the world's largest stork, the jabiru, because it has an open canopy for takeoff and landing. Here's the pampas deer, caimans. And just to remind where the Brazilian biomes are and their proportions. And I pointed here where the Chaco is. It's not on the official Brazilian map yet. We are trying to get it on. But it's not just because it's small, it's neglected, forgotten, and ignored. And the black and white map by Coutinho 2016 has a more detailed ecological concept of biome and has 3 times more biomes here in Brazil. Well, starting with the Pantanal, it's surrounded by highlands in the upper Paraguay River basin. And the hills are very different from the lowland. On the highlands, we have a dry forest and cerrado. For example, on the right first picture, we have a dry forest on limestone and green vegetation of cerrado on sandstone and granite. And further down, floodable forest, evergreen, and there are some Amazon trees can grow because we have 2 added wet periods, the rainy season and the flood time. And on the Pantanal plain, it's largely a floodable savanna, very variable. And on the hills, it's much more likely to find an endemic plant because the Pantanal is geologically very young. Well, where the Pantanal flora comes from, I consider the white distribution group the main one. And there are the grassland species. Some of them occur in South Brazil, and I already recognize them in the Pantanal. And they may occur in the llanos of Venezuela and Colombia, in Suriname, and so on. And the second group is the cerrado. I'm going to talk more in detail about the cerrado. But more in area, it's important in the Pantanal. And then seasonal deciduous forest, the dry forest of the caatinga, related to the caatinga, many shared species. And so with the dry forest of the Bolivian chiquitanos. Some inland Atlantic forest, Paraná Basin species reach the Pantanal. And then from the Chaco, I'm going to talk later. A few from the Amazon, as I said, and of course, weeds and rural species, they're everywhere, mainly on disturbed areas like roads and cattle ranches, homesteads, and very few endemic species. Half of them are wild peanuts. So few Arachis species endemic. The Pentanal vegetation is called a mosaic of woody, floodable grassland savanna, and also aquatic vegetation. Some of the aquatic vegetation is just seasonal. And I would say what at first looks like chaos, it's organized by water, not just surface water, but the water near the surface, underground, it influences a lot. The first picture may look like an orchard, but where the little clump is, there are trees and shrubs growing on a slightly higher ground. And then we have forest islets on larger hummocks, 1 to 3 meters above the flood level. The second picture, we have open drainage landscape with few woody vegetation. And then the closed vegetation, there we have permanent water, more or less permanent, ponds surrounded by grasslands, and then woody ridges. Another interesting type of pond are the alkaline ponds, surrounded by ridges, isolated from the other floodwaters. And so they become full of sodium and potassium carbonates. Well, starting from the river, here is the Paraguay River. It's a very windy, movable river. It keeps moving on all the time. And it leaves behind abandoned riverbeds with aquatic vegetation and swamps and the previous embankments. And these embankments are colonized by pioneer trees like this sapium. And then later on in succession come in more species, and the vegetation comes dense. And later on, not exactly a mature forest, but a taller forest. And because of the flood and wildfires, vines and lianas are very common. They heal up the scars, and they may grow on a more favorable spot. Some of the riverside species may move on towards the floodplain and take over wet grasslands. That's the encroachment, and so become monodominant forests. It's a rather poor forest. It takes decades for them to increase their richness. And it's a problem because these farms lose a lot of grazing lands. Well, the abandoned riverbeds, they run during the flood and stay still during the dry season. And they favor the growth of floating mats over the other floating vegetation. There is a sedge that has entangled rhizomes and that trap sediments and debris and organic matter and build a floating organic soil. And the last picture is a floating island, a floating meadow where 9 people stand on. There are 8 here, but that's me taking the picture, not appearing. And there is a 1 meter deep, under the surface, organic soil, a histosoil. And later on, even small trees can grow on. And in oxbow lakes, like the right top, it favors the Victoria lily. This one, it dries off, the Victoria lily disappears, and the seed stays dormant and comes back when it rains. Other type of monodominant vegetation is this one along the seasonal streams. And during the dry season, some places keep sort of pools with fish, and nearby then wading birds like storks, herons, and spoonbills build their colony nests. But most of the Pantanal has no ponds, no permanent water. It wouldn't look like the standard Pantanal shown in pictures, and it looks quite sad, the landscape. Dry grasslands and cerrado and pure sand. That sand can reach 400 meter deep sediments. And some of the grass species, like this lemongrass, Eleonorus, has oil and it can burn green. Shrubs can also become monodominant. And some aquatic plants can be monodominant, like cattail and the giant sedge, 2 species of water hyacinth, a wild rice, very interesting, it keeps up with the flood 5 to 6 meters. And this rice is edible. It's a sort of a very precious going to the market. And along the water bodies, the rivers and canals, there are floating mats and in a sort of a zonation. You are water hyacinths and wild rice and so on. Well, if I had to show just one picture of the Pantanal, I would choose this one. Why? Well, here we have the harshness of wildfire and flood, 2 very contrasting phenomena that may occur every year. And in between there is regrowth and flowering and fruiting of this Tabebuia. It's a yellow trumpet tree. And the tree is associated with these hummocks or termite hills. In fact, I found only ants in them. And on these termite hills, there are more species than in the flat land in between. And this is very typical in many parts of South Pantanal. Well, what struck me when I arrived was the scarcity of epiphytes. Except this first Bromelia tilancia, that's 3-4 centimeters tall, and it comes from the dry caatinga. Orchids, well, they're mainly terrestrial like these. They withstand grazing, flood, fire. Well, now we're going to the Cerrado. That's the Brazilian savanna. It's the second largest biome in Brazil. Half of it has already gone into agriculture of soybeans, maize, and cotton, and cattle pastures. But on more unfavorable soils like these, well, the Cerrado will remain. On the iron ore near Corumbá, they just scrape off the topsoil and the ore is there ready for export. And trees that may have 20 meters high elsewhere, here they are sort of dwarfed or shrubs. It's a very inhospitable place, and also lightning occurs on the hills, and so we have fires periodically. The second is a sandstone area with these monolites and full of lichens. You would like that. Well, the Cerrado is the richest in species in Brazil, more than 12,000 angiosperms, and many of them are endemic. Here we have an example of 3 fruit trees, and the third one, Caryocaracea. It's an endemic family of the Cerrado. This fruit is the richest in vitamin A so far known. And very important are the Cerrado wetlands on the headwaters. They are called vereda, with or without the Mauritia palm. And they store water year round. It's like a sponge, an organic soil that releases water in the dry, even in the dry season, to the streams and rivers. And it's a very clean water. Campo Grande, where we live, we can drink straight from the tap. And another type are the springs of Serra da Bodoquena, where the place called Bonito is. Bonito means beautiful because of the crystal clear waters where people dive to watch fish. And there my wife found this endemic sedge named after her. And these wetlands of Vereda, they're also very species rich. The first one is a passion fruit, endemic, and discovered by my wife and also named after her. And a few examples of other plants of typical wetland families. And now we're going to the Chaco, which is in the international nomenclature called steppe savanna. It's in the southeast of the Pantanal and connected with the Chaco in Paraguay and Bolivia. It looks very much like the caatinga for being spiny and small-leaved, but there is frost right now. There are frosts there. And it's a very unique vegetation in Brazil. Only here we have Chaco. But despite that, so far we don't have an official conservation unit set aside. Here it's an open Chaco in the dry season, and the selaginella is all dry. It's a fern-like plant that can revive. It becomes green again a day after the rain. And some of these parts are also floodable. But as I said, spiny legumes and small-leaved and lots of cactus. Another view of the Chaco. The first picture is in the dry season, the next in the rainy season, more or less the same spot. Another yellow trumpet tree, single-leaved. It looks very different than the others. And the quebracho. Quebracho is the richest plant in tannin. It was much used during the war to make boots, but it regenerated because the seed is wind-blown, so the seed goes everywhere. In many areas are forested, closed vegetation. You may like the third picture taken by my colleague Spielmann in a tree full of lichens. Also belonging to the Chaco is a monodominant savanna of Copernicia, a palm that withstands a lot of flood and fire. The palm leaves, when they are dry, they're terrific fuel. Also, the Chaco is very rich in species. A few examples here, different from everything else. And at last, we're going to the Pampa. The Pampa is subtropical in South Brazil, and it's connected with much larger areas of Pampa in Argentina and Uruguay. And this, before 2004, it was considered Atlantic forest, but then it was recognized as a very different flora and landscape. This map is not the latest. Where we have here Mata Atlântica, part of this is also Pampa grassland, the grasslands, the highland grasslands. And, well, basically the Pampa are natural grasslands. Natural because we have a lot of endemic species. And more to the west, the soils are very shallow and flat country. And more to the east is rolling country and a bit deeper soil. But this soil, when it's overgrazed or becomes eroded or cultivated, it may expose the rock. And also overgrazed areas can be taken over by an African grass, an invader, very difficult to control, this Eragrostis. And overgrazed areas or cultivated areas, in some of them, underneath they have old ancient sand dunes. When they become exposed, they move again. And it's called desertification. Well, the sand actually has been there undercover. And some areas of the Pampa are bushy, where it's a bit wet or when without cattle. And in the valleys, we have gallery forests and palms. One of these palms is this of the genus Butia. It's an edible fruit. And some palmlands have been removed for cultivation, but now they're going under protection. Well, adios Pampa mia, as says a famous song in Uruguay and Bolivia. This flightless bird is the rhea. It's also common to other open biomes, the Pantanal as well. And I took my grandchildren to know the Pampa. Well, and thank you very much for your attention.